onto one piece of papyrus paper, the kind of paper they had at the time this was written in the first century. 2 John and 3 John, they're about the same size, and what was written there would fit on one piece of paper. Both of these books, 2 John and 3 John, were written by John the disciple. In the gospel that he wrote, John is too humble to mention his own name. By the time he is writing in to the book of 3 John, he calls himself the elder. By this time, late in the first century, John is probably the last of Jesus' 12 disciples who's left alive. He's kind of the elder statesman by this time. He might even be the last, or one of the last few eyewitnesses to Jesus. So he's an old man now, possibly struggling with movement, possibly unable to travel long distances like he might have done when he was a younger man. So John is probably in Asia Minor, the area that is now Turkey, probably at this city Ephesus. So the early church has spread from Jerusalem around 30 AD, around Pentecost. It's gone all up through here, all the way across Turkey, into Greece, and eventually to Rome. Now, we know this because Paul writes letters to all these places. Paul wrote a letter to the Romans, he wrote a letter to the Corinthians, he wrote a letter to the Philippians, who come from Philippi, and he wrote a letter to the Ephesians. So the church has spread all across this area. As it was in the days of Paul's journeys that we see in Acts, it would have been the practice for groups of travelling Christians to move around the towns and cities of this whole area, preaching the gospel, encouraging the Christians who are already there, and generally trying to build the church in all these different places. Now, back in those days, of course, there was no internet, there was no email, and even if you wanted to send somebody a letter, there was no Royal Mail. If you want to send somebody a letter, you had to give it to somebody to carry it by hand. Both 2 John and 3 John are letters of introduction. What would typically happen was when the travelling missionaries, the travelling Christians went out to visit the churches, they would be given a letter of introduction by somebody who would be well known. John the disciple, he would be that everybody knew about, because he's like, and everybody knows about him, so he would be the person that the travelling Christians would show to the people as they went. So 2 John's a letter of introduction like that, and also 3 John. Now 3 John is addressed to a specific individual. 2 John is just to a church, maybe churches, but 3 John, specific individual, Gaius. And this chap, Gaius, seems to be somebody that, well, he calls him his child. Now I don't suppose that means child of the blood, but it would mean that perhaps John had discipled this guy, maybe even part of his conversion. So the situation we see in 3 John is that some people have gone out from the place where John is, probably Ephesus. A bunch of travelling Christians, including a guy called Demetrius potentially, are going to the place where this chap Gaius lives. It sounds like they've been there before. A travelling group has gone to where Gaius lives. They've come back and they've reported to John that Gaius is getting on really well. And now they're going out again. Demetrius going with them. And so 3 John is the letter that John sends with Demetrius on his way to see Gaius. And this is what he says. So this is reading from 3 John now. To my dear friend Gaius, whom I love in the truth. Dear friend, I pray that you may enjoy good health and that all may go well with you, even as your soul is getting along well. It gave me great joy when some believers came and testified about your faithfulness to the truth, telling how you continue to walk in it. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. So here's the elder statesman John rejoicing that this guy Gaius, one of potentially his own kind of people he's discipled, people he's helped, people he's taught in the past, is getting on really well. Walking in the truth here means being a Christian, believing in Christ, and putting his faith into practice. So being a practical Christian as well as being a theoretical Christian. So John continues, "Dear friend, you're faithful in what you're doing for the brothers and sisters, even though they are strangers to you. They have told the church about your love. Please send them on their way in a manner that honours God. It was for the sake of the name that they went out, receiving no help from the pagans. We ought therefore to show hospitality to such people so that we may work together for the truth." So John commends Gaius for his previous hospitality, and presumably the hospitality of his congregation, to the previous set of people that went out. The missionaries for the name. Now what the name here means, that will be the name of Jesus that he's referring to there. And when we talk about showing hospitality to the travellers, this isn't just like, inviting people round for tea. In those days, of course, there were no planes, there were no trains, there were no cars. So travelling around would be foot, possibly with a donkey or something to carry the luggage. And travellers, as they went from place to place, would need help. Obviously, there's no fridges, so having fresh food would be something you would have to pick up at each place you went along the way. You wouldn't be able to carry huge amounts of water. There wouldn't have been any, taps coming off the East Surrey Water Company, so you'd have had to collect water at each place. You might have needed more clothes, you might have needed more money, you might have needed help with the local Roman officials in order to be allowed to travel. So, in terms of helping travellers, people who travel the world, talking about the Christian faith, do we know anybody like that? Anybody we know who travels the world talking about the Christian faith? Sorry? Danny. Yep, okay. So Danny goes out from here. Yep. What about people who come from other places? Because I'm trying to picture the idea, we're Gaius now, potentially people coming from another place to talk to our church, to visit our church, to encourage us, to teach us, and then maybe moving on to somebody else. Lucy and Andrew. I was hoping somebody would say that, because I've got a picture of them. Anybody else? So somebody else who was here a few weeks ago, Imtiaz. So both Lucy and Andrew and Imtiaz are kind of like Demetrius and the missionaries who we hear about in John's third letter. They travel from place to place. They preach, they spread the word, they encourage Christians, and perhaps they will bring back a good report to their churches they've come from about what's going on. One of the things that John talks about when he talks about people who help the travelling missionaries is he says, therefore we ought to support such people so that we may become co-workers with the truth. So this is actually the RSV translation of this same verse. And I picked it because it uses this word co-workers, which is there in the Greek. When we help people like Andrew and Lucy, or like Imtiaz, or any of the other Christian workers who move from place to place, it's not just, we help them, they're gone, that's fine. We actually become part of their work by helping them on their way, by showing them hospitality, yes, place to stay, invite them for a meal, but also things like money, support, praying for them. We become part of their mission. So in helping Andrew and Lucy, helping Imtiaz, we become part of their mission because they can reach places that we can't reach. Imtiaz can go places that probably most of the rest of us can't go, but we become part of his success, part of his mission by helping him when he comes past our place. So, John then turns to talk about this guy Diotrephes. Probably what he says about Diotrephes is the main reason for this letter to Gaius. And he says, I wrote to the church, this is John again, I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to be first, will not welcome us. So when I come, I will call attention to what he's doing, spreading malicious nonsense about us. Not satisfied with that, he even refuses to welcome other believers. He also stops those who want to do so and puts them out of the church. So who's this guy, Diotrephes? It looks like, from the letter, Diotrephes lives somewhere near Gaius. Probably not the same church, because otherwise John wouldn't be busy explaining what Diotrephes is doing, because Gaius would already know. But maybe another church in the same city, or possibly Gaius and Diotrephes are in churches which are in towns which are adjacent to each other. They certainly know of each other. It sounds like Diotrephes is either the leader of a congregation, or maybe somebody who wants to be leader of the congregation. He's certainly somebody of some authority in that he seems to have the ability to throw people out of the church. I looked up what Diotrephes means. The meaning of the name of this guy Diotrephes is nourished by Zeus or fed by Jupiter. So the Dio bit is Zeus and the Trephes bit is nourished by or fed by. And this is an unusual name for a Christian to have. Because Zeus and Jupiter are two names of one of the pagan gods, one of the Roman gods. So it's very unusual for a Christian to have a name which means that they're fed by a pagan god. Curious that he hasn't given up that name when becoming a Christian. Maybe there's a question there about how much of a Christian he is. So, there are three things that Diotrephes is criticised for. Firstly, he says he loves to be first. He's clearly fallen in love with his leadership role. Second thing, spreading malicious nonsense. It says evil words in the Greek. Evil words about who? About John, possibly. More likely about John and the travelling missionaries that have gone out from Ephesus and that will come to visit the place where Diotrephes is. Third thing he's criticised for is he puts out of the church anybody else who wants to help these travelling believers. This is a very strange set of behaviours for somebody who seems to be part of a church. We're not directly told why Diotrephes behaves like this. There's an implication that he sees John, the Apostle John, as some kind of an enemy. I can imagine that if you're enjoying your position of power and authority in a church, and then this guy John, who just keeps on going on about the fact that he knew Jesus personally, must be really irritating if John then sends letters giving out instructions to people, like he does in 1 John 2 John. Must be really irritating if you want to be in charge in your own place, that this Apostle John keeps telling people something different. How very inconvenient. However, it might be more than that. Just jumping back to 2 John for a moment. In his second letter, John has already warned the churches about a set of people who are denying that Jesus is fully man or denying that he's the Christ, the Messiah from God. And we can see these verses in the middle of 2 John. John talks about deceivers who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. He also talks about anyone who runs ahead and does not continue in the teaching of Christ does not have God. Whoever continues in the teaching has both the Father and the Son. So in John's second letter, he's obviously concerned about these people who are denying Jesus' humanity or denying that Jesus is the Messiah. And we see at the bottom of this little section in 2 John, John himself encourages the Christians not to accept travellers who deny Jesus' divinity or deny his humanity. So maybe somehow Diotrephes is on the other side of this argument, and in response to John saying, don't have anything to do with the people who don't hold the right views about Jesus, Diotrephes is saying, oh, well, if you want to do that then, I'm not going to let any of your people come to my place. Maybe that's what's going on now. It's really tempting when we disagree with somebody on a point of theology maybe, or something else, some practical issue, to break fellowship with them. It's a really tempting thing to do. I feel it myself. If somebody disagrees with you, got a different view about something, you're like, no, I want to step back from this. Don't want to have anything to do with you because kind of in my heart I just think you're wrong. We very much want to do that. And maybe if we're in a position of authority somehow, we want to throw these people out even. Either we want to throw them out, or if we can't throw them out, if we disagree too much, we'll just leave the church and go somewhere else. And, that's how all the denominations came to be, fundamentally. It was because a set of people found they just couldn't get on with another set of people, both sets of people being Christians, and therefore some people left, or some people got thrown out. Tricky stuff. It cuts to the heart of who we are and what we believe. But in seeking the right way forward for our congregation, as we're doing at the moment, we need to be very careful that we do not withdraw from those who disagree with us, and that we do not cast out those who prefer a different way. We can disagree without breaking fellowship. I think that's the key thing here. We can disagree with each other on some fairly important things, but that doesn't mean we have to break fellowship with each other. We like seeing ourselves as the good guys in the Bible. If we see John doing the fabulous things, we see Gaius commended, we'll see Demetrius commended in a minute. We like to see ourselves as those guys. But occasionally, actually, the people we should be identifying with are people like Diotrephes who are being criticised. So let's examine ourselves. Are we thinking like him? Are we putting our own views first? Do we love to be first? Shunning people that disagree with us? Do we find it difficult if people have a different view on things like the gifts of the Spirit? Do we find it difficult if people have a different view on women leadership? A different view on church organisation or leadership? Now, it's very interesting. I find it interesting. John is proposing to do about Diotrephes. You might be thinking, well, John's going to steam off down there and he's going to kick this guy Diotrephes out. But actually, no, that isn't what John says. John says, when I come, I will call attention to what he's doing. So John's not going to hide the issue. He's going to focus on, but he's not just going to throw Diotrephes out for having a different view. It looks to me like John is going to seek resolution for this disagreement rather than just chuck people out and make the break permanent. Just thinking about what was said in 2 John. John tells the Christians that if people do not accept that Jesus is fully man, then they should have nothing to do with them. But he also tells them if they do not accept his divinity, that he is the Christ, the Messiah, God made flesh, that they should have nothing to do with them. And I think that these 2 points are probably the only grounds for Christians to break fellowship with other Christians. This, in fact, is what divides Christians away from the sects. The only issue is, what do you say about Jesus? If you agree that Jesus is fully man and he is fully God, and you meet somebody else who also agrees with that, that person is a Christian, you should be prepared to have fellowship with them. Never mind they disagree with you about church organisations or how much water to use in baptism or gifts of the Spirit or anything else. So at the end of 3 John, having spoken about Diotrephes, Gaius then commends this guy Demetrius to Gaius. Demetrius is probably the leader of this travelling group who are coming to Gaius's church with this letter. Dear friend, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good. Anyone who does what is good is from God. Anyone who does what is evil has not seen God. Demetrius is well spoken of by everyone, even by the truth itself. We also speak well of him, and you know that our testimony is true. So this again comes back to the idea of John using this letter as the letter of introduction for the travellers. So John speaks well of him. But it's interesting, you also see Demetrius is well spoken of by everyone, and even by the truth itself. Now the truth here is believing in Jesus and putting your beliefs into practice and living in the right way. And this is what we should hope for, I guess, that the truth speaks well of us. Obviously we want to speak about the truth, but does the truth of the Christian life speak well about us? And I think that's what we should be aiming for, and obviously that's why John is commending this guy, Demetrius.